Is it on? Is this microphone
Yes.
on?
Yep. Everyone can hear us. All right. Beth, are you still there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound loud and clear. I think we are going to get started. I think we are, huge apologies to everyone. This startup did not go. We're in a different room with a different computer and different backup personnel. So apologies for not having a smooth start. This is the second in our, at this point, 3 scheduled webinars for the advisory committee to provide background information on current activities and current issues related to doing regional restoration in San Francisco Bay. Again, I'm Luisa Valiella, and I'm going to be turning it over, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to do a very lengthy introduction of Beth Huning, but all to say that when you think of wetlands in the Bay Area, who do you think of first? Well, Beth Huning. She is the head of San Francisco Bay Joint Venture and is our go-to person for the history and the current push to continue doing large-scale regional restoration and connection with all of our partners around the Bay Area. So Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I will just one more note. Again, we can see the list of people who are attending this webinar, and in that section on the right-hand side of your screen, you have an area that should say a question box. Please feel free to jot questions down and provide them to us as Beth's going to go through her presentation. I don't know if she's going to pause at any point during the presentation, but we will be keeping track of all of the questions that come up and do questions and answers definitely towards the end of the presentation, and that's where I'll be reading from that list and that box and feeding that information to Beth. And if you have any problems hearing or have technical difficulties, you can also ask those questions in the box. So with that, Beth Huning, please take it away.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Louisa. I think I will just move through if you will just ask questions in the box rather than stopping during the presentation, because there's a lot to cover here. And so I'm going to move through it pretty quickly, and what I'm going to be doing is sharing a little bit with you about why we are restoring the wetlands, do a little bit of a tour of the major projects in the different focal regions, and tell you a little bit about the partnerships that we've organized over the years to try to protect, restore, and enhance the wetlands here in San Francisco Bay. So moving forward, most of you have probably seen this slide in the past, but this really gives you an idea of why we are protecting and restoring wetlands. We've lost about 90% of our wetlands here in the Bay, but over the last 15 years or so, we've really begun putting them back. And so what we're really trying to do is move the needle forward in order to meet the goals that I'll share with you in just a little bit. But to give you an idea of why we're doing the wetlands restoration is that we've got a lot of natural resources here, particularly wildlife, in spite of the fact that we're living in an urban area with over 8 million people in our region. And so it's also been identified as a critical area for migratory species, as well as some of those endemics that I showed you a minute ago. We have been identified in an international capacity by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network at their highest status because of the number of shorebirds, which has the highest concentration during migration of anywhere along the Pacific Flyway. And we've also been designated by the International Convention on Wetlands that's run by the International Union for Conservation of Nature as a Ramsar site, which is a wetland of international importance. So this is a very important place on the map, and wetlands really do support most of the species. So just giving you an idea of why we are so important, I'm just going to run through these slides pretty quickly. But we look at wetlands in all kinds of wetlands, but Measure AA is really particularly focused on tidal wetlands and the estuary itself. So I'm just going to move forward a little bit. We realized back in the late 1990s that in order to implement the goals that were being laid out for restoration, this needed to be done through partnerships. So we put together a management board that included our state, federal, and regional agencies, as well as the major nonprofits that work throughout the area. And what we do is protect and restore these wetlands in different geographic regions. And so we work through working committees, and this gives you an idea of who is on our management board, but our partnership includes all of the project managers from some of the small organizations as well as major land trusts such as the Sonoma or Solano Land Trust. And what we try to do is follow the strategic habitat conservation model where we do biological planning, work with our partners on restoration and conservation design. We work on delivery and trying to put projects on the ground, research and monitoring to see how they are doing. And then we also focus very heavily on outreach and policy. And I think that the outreach was a major contributing factor towards passing Measure AA, and policy is also really important to helping us achieve our goals. So part of what we are trying to develop through these wetland restoration projects is implementing a number of different regional planning efforts. The basis was the Baylands Habitat Goals project that was done back in 1996 and started about that time, and that may have been the finishing date, I can't remember. But then recently, in 2015, that was updated with the Baylands for Climate Change. What the joint venture did was to put together an implementation plan of how we were going to implement these goals, and subsequently the Subtidal Goals Project and the CCMP formed the Estuary Partnership, the Tidal Marsh Recovery Plan, as well as some of the specific regional plans. So I'm just going to move this pretty quickly because what we did in 2006 was, 2001 was to lay out the habitat goals that were based upon the Baylands goals, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on the first level of the chart, the Bayland habitats that include the tidal marshes, tidal flats, lagoons, beaches, salt ponds, plus subtidal habitats, which are also very important. And I'm going to be doing a bit of a tour around the region, and we're going to be focusing on the yellow, the orange, the green, the red, and the blue as we go through this presentation. Each year what we do is to track the projects that we know are in the process of being planned. And we have identified this year a number of projects that if we were to add them up, we would need about $383 million. And so it's really important that Measure AA passed. And it also means that we need to be looking at a portfolio of funding sources, that Measure AA is one of the major ones, but it can't be the only one. And we've tried to track these on and evaluate them based upon project adoption criteria that our Conservation Delivery Committee members review and discuss projects and help prioritize them on a fairly continual basis. And if you want to see the list of the criteria that this summarizes, you can go onto the joint venture website that's listed at the bottom of this slide, and it can give you a lot of the details about the habitat connectivity and other issues. But I wanted to show you the outcomes of what we have been working on in the last few years before we begin the tour. And looking at the bay habitats, as you can see, we have made major progress on protecting and acquiring the habitat towards the original goal, but there are still some significant areas that still need to be protected, particularly migration space for wetlands as sea levels rise. We've also made some progress, about a third of our goal towards restoring these areas, but a lot of these projects are on a trajectory that takes place over a number of years. We've also discovered that enhancement of existing wetlands that may not be functioning in their optimal capacity is a pretty good bang for the buck. And so what we've been doing is supporting some of those projects that reduce mosquito populations while increasing tidal flow into existing marshes. So I mentioned that we were going to be focusing on these particular areas on this webinar today, so we're just going to move right through into the North Bay. And this is a map with polygons that shows either the current active or the proposed or projects that have been recently completed if you look in the north of San Pablo Bay. And I'll be pointing these out in more detail as you go along, but as you can see, there are large swaths of habitat in the North Bay that we've been working on or are currently focusing our partnership efforts. We've targeted about 50,000 acres up there, and we have made some major progress towards that at about 30,000. So we're going to start at Hamilton and Belmarin Keys in Marin County. And this is the old Army Air Base that was the center of the war in the Pacific, which was decommissioned probably about 20 years ago or so. And after a lot of different planning, the State Coastal Conservancy took over the property, and the runway that you see in the picture there has been restored to tidal marshes. And this was being done by pumping dredge material from the Port of Oakland harbor deepening through a pipeline from an offloader offshore and beneficially reusing dredge material. This is the largest example at this point of beneficially reusing of dredge material. But that project has been completed in the lower half of this map. But as you note, Belmarin Keys in the northern portion is an area that's currently being planned right now through the current designs and will need to be permitted and constructed. And so there's a lot of work to do to finish this complex at Hamilton and Belmarin Keys. This kind of gives you an idea of where it is on the grand scheme of things. It's a very, very large project. And this is what it looks like after construction from the top of the hill. These cells were built with levees that broke them up, and then the material was piped into each cell before that they were opened. So this is the project under construction at various cells. This was almost instant marsh, and wildlife have been responding to it very quickly because of bringing it up to marsh plain through beneficial reuse. Bahia in the North Bay is a project that was completed primarily in 2008, but there's another phase with some levee work that needs to be done on this particular site. It's another very large project that's not too far from Hamilton and Belmarin Keys. And this map kind of shows you where it is. And I'm obviously not going to be able to hit on every single project up here. You'll see Marsh Creek and a number of others. I'm just mostly pointing out the big ones at this point. But there are a lot of projects that provide habitat connectivity. And I don't want to downplay the smaller ones, but they're all important. And this, again, was a major partnership that was operated by a volunteer group, the Marin Audubon Society, using professional designers and heavy construction equipment. And it was done primarily as a project to benefit the Ridgeways Rail, the endangered Ridgeways Rail. Just showing you some pictures of what it looked like under construction. Most of these restoration projects require a lot of earth moving. And so unless there's the opportunity to breach a levee that's at marsh plain, a lot of earth needs to be moved around because these projects are heavily subsided either through pumping of groundwater or, in the case in the North Bay, farming and oak hay. So this was a mix of mostly tidal wetlands along the Petaluma River near the mouth of the Petaluma River, but it also includes some seasonal wetland ponds. So you can see a little bit more about these projects from Highway 101 across to the Mare Island Bridge through a wetlands tour that we have on our website, and I'll show you those websites later on in the presentation. But moving across the Petaluma River, just on the other side are the Sears Point wetlands. This is another large project that was managed by the Sonoma Land Trust, but has recently been transferred to the Fish and Wildlife Service as the headquarters of San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And this project had some major challenges to it because we couldn't restore most of it to tidal wetlands, only a portion because of the railroads and the need to keep highways high and dry. And one of the themes of a lot of these restoration projects is the fact that they have to be heavily engineered and in some cases managed because of having to work around infrastructure. This shows you where it is, And this is what it looked like under construction. You can see in the picture a lot of what looks like circles or targets on the landscape. These became marsh mounds that were designed to stop wave fetch and accrete sediment on a natural basis because there wasn't sediment to bring in to make this process restore as quickly as it was at Hamilton. As I mentioned, enhancement is a good bang for the buck, and there have been a couple of enhancement projects out in the Sonoma Creek, Tubbs Island area, and this is just one of them that was done by improving tidal flow to an existing marsh, and the wildlife response to this has been pretty impressive. The other one being Sonoma Creek that was completed this last year, and that brought in some channelization that's been developing very nicely. It's reduced mosquito populations. They're now finding salt marsh harvest mice out there. This is what the area looks like. Skaggs Island and the Hare Ranch property are the center of hydrology in San Pablo Bay. And these two units that have been added to the National Wildlife Refuge are undergoing planning right now. And just this last week, we put together a technical team to review the designs at the Hare Ranch restoration, because there is some money from the Natural Resources Conservation Service to begin the restoration, but not nearly enough to complete it. And so this is a project that you're going to be hearing a lot about over the next few years, and would be a good place for some of the Measure AA money to go once these designs are completed and the project's permitted. So this was the old radar antenna fields, and you can see that some pictures of the barracks and the water tower out there. These are all gone now, and the area is being protected for restoration. The Napa-Sonoma Marshes has a number of units, and these are managed by the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we've got two large managers plus a number of NGOs out there, and I just realized I have a misspelled word there. I apologize. So this has been done in phases, and we've used money from not only the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Wildlife Conservation Board, but right now ponds 7 and 8 in the very north part, the bittern ponds that you can see in that aerial photograph, are under construction using wastewater treatment from the city of Santa Rosa. So this is kind of an ongoing project, but the southern ponds were completed, and it's a really important area. So as you look at this map, these are the polygons that are over towards the right along the bay shore. And one of the benefits of the projects there, particularly in Pond 1, where you get a lot of shorebird use, is the fact that it's pulling in a lot of wildlife, which is what it was intended. Moving further up the Napa River, which if we just go back 2 sites, would be the very far right polygons there in pink. That is the Green Island unit of the Napa-Sonoma Marshes, which was called the Napa Plant Site. And these were the old crystallizer beds that were open to tidal action in 2009 and have been responding with restoration and accumulating sediment and lots of native fishes that have been showing up there, which is great. About 90% of the fish counts. There are breeding snowy plovers and least terns out here. And it's a great area for wildlife and a good one to visit if you want to get out and explore, because there are trails around the area. The project that's currently under restoration right now is Cullinan Ranch. And this has been done in several phases, with the large phase that was completed in 2015. But right now there is before I get into what's going on now, one of the challenges with this project was having to work around a subsided highway 37 that at this particular area is below sea level because of subsidence. So Caltrans required the building of about 1.5 mile long levee to protect the highway that is below sea level. And so they used these foam cells so that they weren't putting a lot of weight in it to cause it to subside anymore. So it's a really unique project. And the picture in the bottom right here shows what it looked like about a week after restoration. And the canvasbacks that are one of our target waterfowl species have found this site and are using it probably more heavily than they are any other area in the Bay Area right now. But what's really interesting about this project is that about 300 acres were set aside and not done as part of the original restoration. And this is where dredge material is being used to bring this area to marsh plain much more quickly. The other sites are probably going to not sediment in for up to about 50 years, where they would become salt marsh and Ridgway's rail habitat. But over a 5-year period, using dredge material from the Richmond Harbor, this site is being prepared and accepting dredge material and will be ready to hopefully host Ridgway's rail and endangered species much more quickly than the larger portion. So I wanted to also point out the fact that subtidal habitats are really important to the work that we're doing, particularly the substrate, eelgrass and shellfish beds and mounds, because this is where a lot of the fisheries for which the wildlife depend are spawning. And so we are working with the State Coastal Conservancy and some of our partners to also focus on restoration or protection of some of these important subtidal habitats. And we do have podcasts on our website as well, so you can learn about these projects. And I mentioned that tour. Moving around the North Bay down to the North Richmond shoreline, we've identified about a dozen parcels that have the potential for protection and restoration. The area between Point Pinole and Point San Pablo have the richest eelgrass beds anywhere in the estuary. The Dawson family marsh, which was the Bruner property, has now been restored and is opened on April 22nd for public visitation. So we encourage people to get out there. And again, there was infrastructure issues with the completion of this project, but this was done by the East Bay Regional Parks, and we encourage people to go visit it. Moving into our Sassoon region, there are a number of projects, and I'm only going to hit on a couple of the big ones. But we do a lot of work with the East Bay Regional Parks District and some of the other partners along the Contra Costa shoreline there. One of the projects that's currently being developed by the East Bay Regional Parks District is the Bay Point Restoration. It's 31 acres, but this is a restoration project that is in a population area along the shoreline there where they have well below poverty line income. And a lot of the people that use this site are doing so for subsistence fishing and hunting. And so it's a really important site to get this restored. And right now, the East Bay Regional Parks District has been submitting grant proposals and very aggressively trying to fundraise for getting this project done, as it supports a very underserved community along in the area there on the Contra Costa shoreline. The large project out in that area is Dutch Slough, which is out in Oakley and Brentwood. The lead partner on that is the Department of Water Resources. The State Coastal Conservancy has been very active in that. This is a project that is nearing construction. It's the design and the permitting has taken a while, but it's hopefully going to be constructed fairly soon. But this is one that will probably also be seeking funds. The Central Bay projects are a lot different from those in the North Bay and in Sassoon, because this is the heavily urbanized interface where the marshes meet the developed community. These are also projects that are often run by either the Parks District or by a lot of smaller NGOs and organizations such as Golden Gate Audubon. They often involve and engage a lot of community support. So as I go through this, you'll see where people are involved in helping to restore the projects. This is also an area in the Central Bay where a lot of our wintering waterfowl tend to congregate after they forage in San Pablo Bay. So that area in the Central Bay is really an important area for waterfowl. We just don't get to survey them very often because of the proximity to airports and the inability to access them for surveys from the air. But a lot of the research has shown that this is where they tend to congregate. So these areas are very, very important. And looking at the Central Bay, we're defining that as the area between the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge and the San Mateo Bridge on either side of the bay. One of the projects that's under construction or in 2 phases is Yosemite Slough, which is the old Candlestick Point. You can see the old Candlestick Ballpark out there. It's not a large project, but it's an important project given its proximity to the Bayview Hunters Point community. And that site, along with the Heron's Head March, which I'm not going to show pictures of, and Pier 94 are very good access projects that are being designed for public access for residents that live in those communities. The State Parks Foundation is currently seeking funds for construction of Phase 2, which is really the slough area and some of the public access up the slough. So that's a project that you're probably going to be hearing more about as these are, the plans are being developed and the permit and funding is being put together. On the east side, another small project, but an important one, is West Stage Marsh and Baxter Creek. This is being managed by the University of California, and they're doing some enhancement and some work there in the marsh on the west side particularly. The east side is supporting endangered ridgeways rails, and this is another area that canvasbacks like to frequent and hang out. And it's also an area that has the Bay Trail passing through it, and it shows that sensitively designed public access in the right places can work. There's some completed projects in here. I mentioned Pier 94. Here's a group that's removing invasive spartina in the lower portion. And in Corte Madera, there's a marsh called Triangle Marsh that's very close to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Corte Madera Ecological Reserve. And that reserve has just recently had an acquisition to add to it that's being managed by Marin Audubon Society. And they're in the process right now of doing a design to help protect the marsh against sea level rise and to provide some upland transitional habitats in that area. So this is an area that has seen continuous work and will probably continue to do so up Corte Madera Creek for some time. Another interesting project down in the San Lorenzo area is the Oro Loma Marsh Climate Adaptation Project. And these are seasonal wetlands that are being designed to be connected to the Oro Loma Marsh horizontal levee, which you see in these pictures. That project was just completed, and it's a design tapering levees and then building through the project some seasonal wetlands and water treatment wetlands at the Oro Loma Sanitary District. And the horizontal levee project is a pilot project to see whether these horizontal levees will work in other portions of the bay. And this particular project, the next phase, is to build some seasonal wetlands and then connect the hydrologies. So that one is a project that's under design and seeking funds and permits now. I mentioned that there are a number of projects that I don't have time to cover. There are a number in San Francisco and all along the East Shore. And I do have a project list, and when the Restoration Authority list is out, you'll be able to see that there are a number of them from the Central Bay that are under consideration and in need of funding as we work on trying to connect even these postage-sized wetlands and provide habitat connectivity. Moving into the South Bay, these projects represent about 90% of the wetland restoration opportunities in the South Bay. And this project, the South Bay Salt Pond Project, is the largest wetland restoration project on the West Coast. It's being managed by our partners, the State Coastal Conservancy, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's about 14,000 acres of the old industrial salt ponds that were managed by Cargill for salt operations and are no longer in production, although part of the refuge is in production. The Phase 1 restoration was completed a couple of years ago and costing about $34 million. The phase 2 is under environmental review right now, permitting and fundraising. And I'll just go through some of the projects that were part of phase 1. I can't hit on every one of them, and then tell you a little bit about phase 2. So some of you have probably seen these maps. This is 3 complexes, the Eden Landing Complex, the Alviso Complex, and what's shown here as the West Bay Complex, or the Ravenswood Ponds. Just to the north of that, on the left, are the green, heavily dark green areas that are Bear Island, which is the largest island in San Francisco Bay. And some restoration has taken place there as well. So these units are being planned not only through different phases, but also different phases in each of the different units. And so moving into some of the early restoration phases were the island ponds. Oops, let me go back here. Eden Landing. So let's see. Where's my clicker? There. The restoration here has been about a 10-year process done in phases. The last process of the Eden Landing State Wildlife Area was completed last year, not even a year ago, and it's now been open to public access with the Bay Trail going through there. But there are a lot of different sections of Eden Landing that still need to be restored. So this is what it looked like before and under construction. And this is what the closer map of the area looks like as well. So the ponds that were under construction were some of these northern ponds and the eastern ponds. And then there's still quite a bit to do in some of these other areas. This just shows what it looks like when we do construction jobs. And then moving into the Alviso ponds at the very south end of the bay, these are the ponds that are protecting Moffett Field, some of the Cargill area, Silicon Valley area, and the town of Alviso, which is very heavily subsided. And so there was quite a bit of work that was done on the NAP tract here, the island ponds, and some restoration that was done as part of phase 1. And in the Alviso ponds, this just gives you an idea of just some samples of the work that was completed there. And the Ravenswood ponds are those that are in blue, just south of, right in this area here. And those included, let's back up here. Those included ponds SF2, which were designed for snowy plover habitat with the islands that were intended to be nesting islands where they placed oyster shells, and did some experimental designs, some of which worked and some of which didn't. But right next to that are the Mountain View ponds, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But we're going to move just north into Redwood City to Bear Island, which was that large island that I mentioned. And that's been done in phases as well. There's inner, middle, and outer Bear Island that has been restored over a period of time, with inner Bear being completed in 2016. Oops. So before I move into the conservation toolbox, the next phase of the South Bay Salt Pond project is taking a while because they had to go through another environmental review process. But the Mountain View ponds in the Ravenswood complex are the first ponds that are destined to be constructed. And so Ducks Unlimited, the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, they're out fundraising right now. They've secured some funding, but not all of the funding to do the Ravenswood ponds. So I mentioned that we've got a lot of tools that we use, and in order to do all of this restoration, we try to work through deciding what would be the best treatment, what kind of work needs to be done on the project, and how we can accomplish it. And with the Measure AA funding being a new major source, that's going to help augment a number of our other federal programs that are in our toolbox, because we recognize that not one funding source can provide funding for all of these projects. So it's really important to be able to identify and line up the project with the funding source that best matches, and not every project is going to use all of these funding sources. So part of what the joint venture does is work with our partners to build portfolios and figure out where would be the appropriate funding. And if these projects are projects that have been identified as joint venture priorities, we will help them raise those funds by sending letters of support, talking with funders. We meet pretty regularly with some of our funders to be able to show them what the priority projects are at a particular point in time so that they can understand that the restoration community has broad support for either launching or completing specific projects. So the restoration is going to take a while, and you're seeing it happening all over the estuary. And it's been started, and we've made some major progress, but we've got a lot to do, and so I am really pleased that Measure AA passed, because it's really going to help accelerate the restoration and help us keep pace with sea level rise and meet those goals of doing as much of this work in the next 15 years as we possibly can. So people are always in the field and out there working on projects. We really are trying to change the face of the bay. It's not going to be put back the way that it was, because we have 8 million people living around the estuary with a lot of infrastructure. But what we really are trying to do is restore ecological function, and although we may be working on what appears to be a project-by-project basis, by working collaboratively, we can help design and tie together these projects to provide the benefits for wildlife and people that these projects can do if planned in a systematic way that can help deliver on the habitat. So I encourage you to go and take a tour of some of these projects that are on some of the joint venture websites. We've got audio tours, and we also recently have launched some video shorts of about 90 seconds that highlight projects in each of these geographic areas, and in about 2 weeks we will be releasing the latest on Eden Landing. So that concludes my presentation, and I will turn it back to Louisa so that we can address questions.
Thanks, Beth. That's an amazing amount of information that you were able to cram into 40 minutes. I really, really appreciate it. I'm not seeing questions pop up, but I actually had a few questions as I was listening to you, so I'm going to start with my own until I see more questions come up in the question box. You started with that great map with the color blobs for the different regions, so you obviously didn't touch on coastal watersheds as not necessarily being of interest to the audience today. But I also wondered about, as the advisory committee has made the recommendation that projects be defined in a geographical area that was limited by the head of tide, how that worked with those color blobs. I'm assuming that perhaps those color regions are including your kind of creeks and river category and not focused on tidal wetlands. Is that correct?
That's correct. You can see on the yellow the Russian River section. Our major focus in the Russian River is not only the river itself, but the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which is the 7th largest seasonal wetland complex on the continent. And it obviously does not meet the criteria for Measure AA. But as I showed you that conservation toolbox that we use, it will qualify for some of those other funding sources. So we've got some opportunities here with Measure AA to focus on the projects that are within the estuary, and that may even free up some funding for some of these other geographic areas. And you mentioned, Louisa, head of tide, which is part of what we have been trying to encourage the Restoration Authority to consider, because we've got ridgeways rails living way up some of these creeks and rivers and tidal marshes forming up there. We realize that if the riparian projects probably don't qualify for Measure AA funding, and if we were to look at riparian and upland projects, that would dilute the source of funding and would not meet the qualifications of the state legislation that authorized the development of the Restoration Authority to begin with. But moving up head of tide, where we do have some of these tidal marshes that are up these creek systems, I think is totally appropriate.
Great. Okay, so we do have questions coming in, so I'm going to read the first one. can you please elaborate on how you may be able to help the Restoration Authority grant applicants identify and access these other funding sources, such as the ones that you've listed, and I know that are also on your website?
Well,
the
two easiest things are to sign up for our bulletin. So you can go to our website if you're not already receiving the joint venture bulletin that goes out about every 3 weeks, and we put grant sources and keep our grant funding page on our website up to date. And so we will send out a bulletin that announces the upcoming grant applications for everything that we know that's in the immediate future that's within a reasonable time frame. And if you go to our website and pull down the funding page, you'll be able to see and sort through a lot of the different funding opportunities. If your project is on the joint venture project list, which means it's met our criteria to be supported by the broad partnership in the restoration community, it also means that as your project is under development, we can either help you with your design, or we can help advise you to put together a funding plan for the most appropriate sources of funding that could support your project. And so also by working with both the project managers and with the funders, we can kind of help match where the best funding sources would be. And in some instances, knowing that there are certain criteria that funders are looking for, we might steer you away from wasting your time on a specific application as well.
Great, thank you, Beth. I'll note that we have an extremely talented group of listeners. So there's been one clarification from a listener that the example provided on the Napa Sonoma Marsh is using recycled water from the Sonoma Valley, not Santa Rosa.
Yeah, I meant Sonoma Valley. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, next question. So you seem to focus a lot on restoration for the purposes of bird life, and you might want to get into describing more of the endangered species versus species of interest versus general biodiversity. But the question is, are you doing anything, you being the greater you, the restoration community, to enhance riparian habitats so that there's a benefit to other species like possums, foxes, etc.?
Yes, and if with our project list, and I should have probably thrown in a slide, but in the interest of time, I didn't include a slide that showed our wetland tracker project where we track all of these projects. We track quite a number of riparian projects. We look at wetlands as being all kinds of wetlands. As when I showed the slide here earlier on that showed our goals, I want to get out of there and back this up right here. We've identified goals for seasonal wetlands, which these are out of date. We've updated those since we did this, and for creeks and lakes and riparian areas as well. And so we do work with partners on all kinds of wetlands, and we've been working quite a bit with the RCDs on criteria and for enhancement of stock ponds also, recognizing that these stock ponds are some of the main sources of fresh water on the landscape.
Great, thank you. Great example too. I have a question. You actually, I want to make sure it's not lost, the difference between restoration and enhancement projects, and you were making the case that enhancement has actually proved to be quite successful in the bang for buck category. And then the examples that you gave were, for the most part, increasing tidal circulation with the most measurable benefit being reduction in mosquito control or having to do mosquito abatement. Can you give, is that the most typical kind of enhancement project that is done, and are there other examples for other purposes?
There are. We consider removing invasive plants such as invasive spartina as a habitat enhancement. And the invasive spartina project has been very extensive throughout the estuary to try to reduce that invasive species that could colonize and take over the mudflats and some of the tidal marshes. So that's another example of enhancement. I did mention increased tidal flows, but it also changes the quality of the marsh. so that other species can use it. And so there are different examples of enhancement. Part of what I was thinking when I was sharing those were those, what they call the centennial marshes, or the strip marshes, up along the northern reaches of San Pablo Bay. Those are new young marshes that were developed through sediment that came down from the gold rush hydraulic mining and colonized the marshes on the outboard side, and never developed the historic channels and the kind of water circulation and flow that the more ancient historic marshes had. So by doing these enhancement and cutting channels and allowing channels to then develop on their own, it really increases the water flow and the habitat quality to an existing marsh.
Great. We have a question that's more specific, or going back to the issue of funding and how to continually scan for, as you say, fitting the right funding opportunity to the project. The question is, and you might need to clarify if the JV itself provides funding, because that seems to be what this question implies. Do you plan to add the JV to funding opportunities, the JV funding opportunities to EPA's water financing clearinghouse? And how do people partner with you to add the funding opportunities that you're aware of to their, so that they know about it?
Yes, usually we try to scan as many different funding sources as we can. We're always getting them brought to us by different funders, so we look at them pretty carefully to see whether or not they would even support our projects. They might support other types of projects, but if they don't support the types of wetland projects that are on the mission of the joint venture, we don't usually post them or promote them on our website, because our partners probably would not qualify for those funding sources. But we're always looking for new funding sources that could meet our goals. And if anybody knows of any, please bring them to us so that we can encourage our partners to submit applications. I'm sure they're out there, the ones that we don't know about. And so if you've got one that you would like us to be aware of and to promote, we would like to know about it. Beneficially
You mentioned Cullinan Ranch, that it used a significant amount of beneficially reused dredged material. Can you describe the benefits from this approach, and what other projects would benefit from further use of beneficially reused dredged material?
Great. That's a really good question, because this is a novel approach to restoration. We are in a situation where we don't have the amount of sediments that are being brought down through the systems, through the rivers and channels that once did. Dams have gotten in the way. Most of the gold rush sediment is already down here. There's a lot of development in the watersheds where there are restricted water flows, and so we don't have the kind of sediment inflow. Yet there's a lot of dredging that occurs within the estuary on a continuous basis, both by the Army Corps of Engineers, by the ports, by the refineries, by the marinas. And although there has been a plan over the last 15 years or so for reducing the amount of dredge material that's being disposed of at disposal sites and trying to use it beneficially, we still have a long ways to go. And through pilot projects such as what happened at Sonoma Creek and now at Hamilton, we found that by bringing in dredge material, placing it in areas that are destined to be restored, the marsh plants colonize much more quickly because the level of the restoration site is at marsh plain. So by using this dredge material rather than taking it to the deep ocean disposal site or disposing of it in bay, we're able to build marshes much more quickly. Cullinan is the site that's currently permitted to receive material, and as well as Montezuma out in Sassoon. And Cullinan is taking the port of Richmond's dredge material, but Belmarin Keys is being considered for dredge material. Eden Landing is a possibility for dredge material, possibly from the port of Redwood City. We have a program that we call Set a Match, which is similar to a speed dating service. We originally sat down in a room with dredgers and the suppliers, along with the restoration project managers that needed material, and did a whole speed dating. We now have an online service with a SETAMatch website that we're just now starting to populate. It provides specifics about the supply, the type of material that someone has, and the type that's needed. And we're trying to do a better job of making matches online. There are a lot of challenges with beneficial reuse of dredge material, but we're trying to work through those and find solutions as well. And I think we've got broad-based support from both the dredging as well as the restoration community. So you'll be seeing other places that are going to be permitted and receive dredge material. The point I want to make is not enough in the system to supply all the marshes. And so we have to be very careful about prioritizing and working with project managers to get the material in the best spots that need it.
That's a great note to end on, Beth. Thank you very much. I want to be respectful for everybody's time. Sorry we started late, so there weren't more time for questions. I will note that this issue of sediment supply naturally in the bay was part of our prior talk with Phil Trowbridge, and it may very well come up in every other webinar that we do. It is a major issue for large-scale regional wetlands restoration in San Francisco Bay. Where are we going to get the sediment that we need to get our marsh plains up to a level where they can even be marshes now and can be marshes in the future with sea level rise? So thank you, Beth, and I think we are going to conclude, and I sure hope you all sign up for our next webinar. I don't have the date off the top of my head, but we'll be getting more restoration information from Michelle Orr as our next presenter. Thank you very much for your time.